I'm Spencer Mazyck, and welcome to our legal guide to starting a technology company. Joining us to discuss important aspects of the formation process is Edward Zimmerman. Ed is founder and chair of the tech group at Lowenstein Sandler, and he works with growth and startup companies as general outside counsel and in VC, PE, angel deals and exits. He is also the perfect guest for our series, so welcome, Ed. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Spencer. Delighted to be here.
So let's begin with choosing the right entity. Why are the vast majority of technology companies formed as Delaware C corporations instead of, say, LLCs?
You know, earlier today, a client asked me why Delaware and said, I've just been told, just do Delaware, don't worry about it. And I thought to myself, that's the right answer. Just leave it there. But in truth, the reason is that Delaware has this incredibly well-developed body of law, and every corporate lawyer in America is tasked with understanding the law of the corporation law of his or her home state and Delaware. And because it has this very well-developed body of law and a very sophisticated court, there's so much more predictability to Delaware than to other states that even though the law in Delaware might be a little bit better, or maybe on one or two points it might be a little bit worse than the law someplace else, everyone's forms are based on it. For venture deals, everyone's forms for M&A are based on it. The disclosures out there for public companies are based on Delaware corporations. And predictability means that we can help our clients make better decisions and understand what's going to happen next. So Delaware has really become the sort of lingua franca for corporations in America.
So is there a growing trend, though, of corporations incorporating in other states? Like, say, are some Silicon Valley startups incorporating in California?
Some Silicon Valley startups have always incorporated in California, and there was actually this interesting battle between California and Delaware that they duked out, and there was a Supreme Court case on this as to whether California law could apply to a Delaware corporation headquartered in California. And the law basically says no. We're not sure how California might feel about that. But in Delaware, they will respect the fact that it was set up in Delaware. So I would say that that trend is actually a shrinking trend, and in our Palo Alto office, we're mostly encouraging people to set up in Delaware as well.
So why a corporation and not an LLC? I know that corporations have a drawback in that it's double taxation, so why form as a corporation and not an LLC?
Yeah. So back when I was in law school and had a full head, almost a full head of hair, LLCs, LLC, I love your haircut, by the way. LLCs were just sort of starting, 20 years ago. And LLCs were really created to make these dynamic, very flexible entities so that sophisticated parties could do business together in a format that enabled them to optimize for taxes and for other things that sophisticated parties needed to do. And so a good rule of thumb is if you have an in-house tax lawyer on staff, you should use an LLC. If you don't have an in-house tax lawyer on staff, the documents can be kind of complicated. And when a great employee is deciding between a job with your company and a job with a corporation, they're going to look at how much equity they're getting, because the whole ball of wax for these kinds of companies is really how much equity can I get? Can I get rich? Am I going to feel passionate about working at this company? And with stock options, I'm going to be able to say, here are 1,000 options at 5 cents a share. And everyone kind of knows what that means.
Right.
With an LLC, I'm going to say, let me give you some units or interests, and here's this 50-page document with 17 pages of tax stuff in the middle that only 6 guys in the country, and I'm not one of them, understand. And so
nobody knows what that means.
Well, there are people. I'm just not smart enough to be one of them. But it becomes really difficult to sort of muddle through giving equity to employees in an LLC. And because there's so much flexibility and it's such a dynamic format, there's a great deal of uncertainty.
Well, is ownership transfer also complicated with an LLC versus a corporation?
It's a little complicated, but it's all of the things that happen around consent and how do we do this. And there are constantly tax issues that arise in the ordinary course. With stock and stock options, tax issues arise when you do something, unless you've made a mistake, and we may get to talk about that a little later.
Okay. Well, and is there ever a time whenever a startup would begin as an LLC and then later convert to a corporation?
Sure. There are some times when someone who's working mostly full-time or totally full-time, and it's just one person So you don't have to split the equity. It's just one person.
Okay.
Then they can start as an LLC and convert. But most venture funds, and there are tax issues at the venture fund level, are going to need to invest in C Corp entities, not LLCs.
Okay, so let's talk about capital structure or the different types of company shares. What are the basic classes of shares, and would you recommend that an early stage startup just stick with the basics?
You know, it's a great question, and they're sticking with the basics, but really what I'd focus on is how do we prepare the company today for the next several phases of its life, for a venture deal or an angel deal, for an M&A transaction or an IPO. Those are the exits that we talk about with these companies.
Right.
And in order to do that, one of the things that you're focused on is how do I set this up in a way that enhances or facilitates our opportunity for a venture funding by keeping it relatively straightforward. It's hard enough to get funding in this environment.
Right, yes, I can imagine.
So you don't want to create structural impediments. So sticking with common stock for founders is straightforward. Sticking with a Delaware C Corp is straightforward. Using a set of well-worn documents that people can understand and that will harmonize with the forms that the venture capital investors are going to be using.
Well, so when issuing shares to founders, you mentioned that, is more always better, and what are the concerns here?
You know, it's funny, about 15 years ago when I was a young lawyer, I was working on a large merger or acquisition transaction, and there were two founders who owned all of the stock, and they were selling for a tremendous amount of money. They were going to become very, very wealthy. And just before the closing, they called me in and they said, "We'd like you to do a stock split." And I said, "You guys own the whole company. Why do you want to do a stock split?" They said, "Well, right now we each own 50 shares, and we'd like to say that we each own 10 million shares when we're talking about the deal months from now at cocktail parties."
Right,
I said,
right.
No problem. So more doesn't matter because really you need to think about it in terms of percentage ownership rather than number of shares.
That's interesting. And I want to ask you, have investors recognized any pattern of problems that companies usually have when they set up or when they start up?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things to focus on is that when you're starting to get to know investors, it's really a job interview, a very protracted job interview. Could be a 6-month job interview. And so as you're going through the process, making sure that you're giving them signals that indicate that you know what you're doing, that you found the right advisors, that you use the customary formats, because they want to see that you're someone who can understand how to get to the right answers, even if you don't know them. You don't have to know them. We don't need you to have gone to law school. You shouldn't go to law school. But knowing that you can get to the right answers. So I think that investors realize that when people have cut some corners, that's okay. When they've played very fast and loose and made silly mistakes on tax issues that they could have avoided by using the right advisors or using the right structures, that gives them a little pause because they're thinking, well, are they going to make major business mistakes like that or be very sloppy in running their business? They cut people some slack for cutting corners, but not for huge mistakes.
Right. Well, and I have to ask you, though, as an early stage startup, how do I hire and retain talented employees when I can't afford to pay them? I'm just starting.
Yeah. You really have to sell the dream. And as an angel investor, and I've invested in about 30 different companies, I'm always looking for particularly passionate and almost charismatic, and I say almost charismatic leaders because you have to be able to sell the dream and convince someone that they're going to be part of something bigger than just them.
Okay.
And I think that getting people to roll up their sleeves and commit, we want to see, and I teach this in my class at Columbia Business School, we want to see that founders have skin in the game and are committed. It's why you never invest in someone who's working part-time on a project.
Right.
You wait until they take the leap, because why should I put my capital at risk if they're not putting themselves and their reputations at risk? So one of the ways that you entice people is you give them equity and you work with the principle that unless I enable my employees to do really, really well and be aligned with me, I'm never going to get rich unless my partner gets rich.
No, that's a very good point. And we're going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time. But thanks very much, Ed, for joining us. I told you you would be the perfect guest.
It's very kind of you. It's been fun. Thank you.
Ed Zimmerman of Lowenstein Sandler. Stay tuned for the next installment of our series. But in the meantime, for more information on this or other topics, subscribe to BloombergLaw.com and you can follow us on Twitter. Thank you for joining us. Bye, everybody.